About a month ago, the VN's subreddit, linked below, which is for all things visual novels, had a contest called Read This, where the idea is to pick a visual novel and explain to everyone why they should read it. Now, I didn't participate, but I had a great time reading through the threads that people were making. So after some thought, I decided that this is something I want to do here on the channel, so I can shill some good visual novels and share my love of them with you. So with that, let's kick things off with Adventure of a Lifetime. Adventure of a Lifetime is a coming-of-age story, or a Bildungsroman if you want to impress your literature nerd friends, that also features a light romance plot. It's a very short visual novel. I personally finished all routes in under 5 hours combined. It's set in the Ogasawara Islands of Japan. The plot follows the protagonist Hiroki, his childhood friend Chisa, and Emily, a visitor to the islands. Emily traveled to Ogasawara in search of an important treasure which had sank into the sea many years before. Before long, Hiroki and Chisa decided that they were going to help. So why should you read Adventure of a Lifetime? Well, my big takeaway was the themes and how they were reinforced by the story. All coming-of-age stories are about moving on to some capacity. There comes a time in everyone's life where things change at a fundamental level and you have to leave behind what you know in pursuit of something new. Many of these stories will usually be kind of bittersweet. Adventure of a Lifetime does this as well, though I'd say it's a little more sweet than bitter. As I mentioned in the overview, the driving plot point is Emily's search for a lost treasure that clearly means a lot to her. I'm not going to say what it is because spoilers, but I think it's safe to say that its value is more emotional than material. But while this treasure is important, does drive the plot, and is significant to the story, that's not really what Adventure of a Lifetime is about. It's about the characters, Hiroki, Chisa, and Emily, first and foremost. Each of them has their own set of issues to work through, regrets from the past, tasks for the present, and trepidations for the future. And through this journey, this adventure, the three of them can grow as people and as friends. The story itself was a bit of an emotional roller coaster with incredible highs that really drove home a sense of joy, excitement, or optimism. There were also some lows where the characters experienced setbacks, emotional turmoil, and made difficult, heart-wrenching decisions, and not always the right ones. The highs and the lows made for a good contrast that kept me engaged with the story and invested in its outcome. To me, it felt very realistic. In real life, people and emotions are rarely ever straightforward, and personal growth usually isn't just a straight line, and Adventure of a Lifetime really drove that home. It's a bit of a cliche in many stories that each character has that one defining flaw and everything about them that's less than perfect can be traced back to it, and once it's fixed, they're all better. But people don't work that way, and I really have to give props to the writers for recognizing that. The characters, more so Emily and Chisa than Hiroki, each had important flaws and memories that impacted them in a negative way, but I never got the sense that it was all-encompassing. Without saying too much because I don't want to spoil it, there was a revelation about a traumatic event that one of the girls went through. It altered her behavior, left her with a lasting sense of guilt, and made her give up on one of her passions. But it didn't break her or change her into something unrecognizable, and it didn't even end up being the main takeaway of her story. Her story was not one of overcoming trauma, but of contrasting her childhood familiarity with her hopes and expectations for adulthood. The trauma did affect her, and working past it was an important step on her journey, but it wasn't this overwhelming fatal flaw responsible for all her ails and heartbreak. To me as a reader, that felt like a very mature and nuanced take that I rarely see in writing nowadays. Adventure of a Lifetime is a story more focused on character than on plot, and it really is the characters that I noticed myself honing in on. Of course, as a fan of slice of life, I may be a little bit biased towards characters over plot, but I do really like the characters and their interactions, and they were a definite highlight for me. Adventure of a Lifetime has two story routes, one for Chisa and one for Emily, though the common route does take up the bulk of the plot. In each route, there's a romance plot between Hiroki and the girl in question, but while this is significant, I never felt that it took over the story in the way that some romances in visual novels can. The story is still about personal growth, and the introduction of love does not change that, but rather acts as a contributing factor to that journey, which is again something I don't see all that often, and I respect it. Another thing I have to praise is how different the romance dynamics were between Hiroki and Chisa compared to Hiroki and Emily, and how it all still felt real and valid. The dynamics of the two relationships in their own story routes were very different, but it all still worked. There was no stale formula to the romance plotlines. It all came together naturally. I really like how the writing felt like a series of subtle touches rather than the blatant emotional manipulation of many romance stories, and I say that as a fan of sappy romantic visual novels. And another thing about the characters is that compared to a lot of visual novels and anime in general, they weren't all that exaggerated. Now this is far from a universal thing, but I've noticed that Eastern media tends to have their characters dialed up to 11. You don't get someone who sucks at expressing affection, you get a bitchy tsundere. You don't get a caring, protective character, you get a full-on mother type. You don't get a cute little sister, you get the cutest, most energetic, most doting little sister on the fucking planet. This is far from something that happens in all Eastern media, but it is a noticeable trend. Adventure of a Lifetime didn't take this route. Chiza and Emily do have their own character quirks, and I'd argue that they're turned up a little bit for the audience's benefit, but it never got into full-on trope territory. There are a few scenes that were played up for comedic effect, but I never felt much of a tonal shift, even when their interactions got a little bit ridiculous. And even as someone who does enjoy my fair share of wacky characters, it's nice to read a more toned down and grounded story once in a while. And the last thing that I'll mention is that this is actually an all-ages title, meaning absolutely no sexual content. There is a bit of light fan service at times, but nothing raunchy. Adult content is pretty common in visual novels, particularly ones that feature romance with attractive ladies, but Adventure of a Lifetime forgoes that, and I think it's to the benefit of the story. One of my issues with many of the sex scenes of visual novels is that I feel like the writers just want to get the titties in front of the audience, and that leads to these super rushed relationships that go from confession to sex in absolutely no time, which is completely unrealistic for many relationships, particularly first relationships. Given the time frame of Adventure of a Lifetime, I just don't feel like sex with either of the two lovely ladies would have made sense in this story, and I'm glad that they decided not to go that route despite potentially losing out on the, hormonal market. In conclusion, Adventure of a Lifetime is a lovely little story about adventure of course, but also about growing up, featuring a plot that was important yet not essential. It was only a few hours of reading, but I enjoyed those hours immensely, and that's why you should read Adventure of a Lifetime. Thanks for watching. I figure I should explain some stuff about the channel now. Since this whole lockdown stuff started, I've been working a whole lot. My shortest work week so far was still pushing 50 hours, and the work itself has been more physically and mentally draining than usual. And honestly, I'm finding it hard to put in the same level of time and effort that I've been putting into YouTube these past few months. So I'm going to be doing these Read This videos fairly frequently until things start to slow down. The shorter format and the fact that I have a large pool of content to pull from, that being visual novels that I have and will read, will mean that I can take some of the pressure off myself while still keeping to my weekly upload schedule. I'll still be doing regular video essays, and I still want to shoot for one game review per month, but don't be surprised if you see a lot of this type of video over however long this quarantine lasts. Thank you for understanding, and I know this is a little bit late, but thank you all for 100 subscribers. It may not seem like a lot, but I really am grateful for all the support you guys have been giving me. If you have any suggestions for me or recommendations for visual novels I could potentially do a read this on, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Well, with all that being said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.